Good morning, everyone. Welcome to keynote presentation at online event, SGInnovate's National Precision Medicine Strategy, supporting data-driven healthcare. I'm Jasmine Chu, Assistant Director from Investment Team of SGInnovate. I'm very excited to kick off today's event and be your moderator for the Q&A section. Before we start, I would like to give you a brief introduction of SGInnovate in case you are new to our energetic and engaging community. We are a Singapore government-backed organization with the mission to build deep tech innovation from Singapore for the world. We invest in and help build deep tech startups in the fields of artificial intelligence, medtech, and quantum tech, just to name a few. We work with entrepreneurial scientists and clinicians to help bring their innovative research from lab to market. And we also develop tech talent and engage with a vibrant deep tech ecosystem. Our events always strive to bring like-minded people together to share their insightful perspective on important topics. We are very happy to be presenting today's event with Precise, which I will leave to Prof. Tan to introduce in details, and partnering with Catalyst for this event. Catalyst is a new innovation hub that connects medicine and health tech startup and clinician innovators to help to turn their ideas into products and services that prevent and cure more disease and save more lives in a scalable manner. Today, we are very pleased to have Prof. Patrick Tan, Executive Director of Precision Health Research Singapore, and here today to share with us more about Singapore's National Precision Medicine Strategy, how Singapore's SG10K Health Cohort Study pioneered the world's most extensive multi-ethnic genomic data bank, and the importance of a data-driven medical approach that can help generate insights to more excellent health and disease prevention, paving the ways for the future of medicine. Just like all of you, I look forward to the opportunity to learn from our brilliant speaker that the great work he is doing to improve the health outcome for Singaporeans. A quick note on the event flow. We will start with the presentation by Prof. Tan, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. I encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A chat box on Zoom, and I'm sure Prof. Tan will try his best to address all the questions you have. So now I will hand over to Prof. Tan to start his presentation. Prof. Tan, please.
Well, thank you very much, Jasmine. And I see that there are about 100 participants on this call, and I do appreciate your time. I was struck by when I looked at the videos and one of my colleagues, Tan Min Han, and his cancer diagnostics company, and that has very strong relevance to what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to try to keep my presentation to about 35 minutes. And what I would like to do is to open up for questions after that and to take in some feedback on how we can perhaps sharpen what we're trying to do for Singapore that also supports the creation of new startups that is very relevant to today's presentation. So what I'd like to do is to take you on a journey, an aspiration on what is precision medicine, Singapore's view on it, and also why does Singapore need it?
While we are solving the technical issue, can you please give us some overview on the organization you are from?
Okay, so obviously while we are sorting this out, maybe I will start off to highlight the effort that we have today. It's called Precise. It's an entity under the Ministry of Health that is supposed to champion the next phase of the National Precision Medicine Program. We're in phase 2. What I'd like to do is actually to highlight some of the opportunities, I think, to work with industry in this space. Okay, can we have the next, does the next slide work? So let me start off today's presentation by defining some terms. Um, we are trying to think about a world where we look at data in how we influence healthcare outcomes. And on the left-hand side is the iceberg that takes into account the different factors that we think about in terms of contributing to an individual's healthcare outcome or a population's healthcare outcome. If you look on the left-hand side, and maybe Clarissa, can you highlight? We have your genes. This is the foundation, what you're born with, what you transmit to your children. And over time, if you go down to the 40%, we have your lifestyle, what you eat, what you drink. Uh, Also, for many individuals, it is your environment. Are you in a place where there is good access to clean air, clean water? And finally, access to healthcare, 10%. And all of these different factors actually combine to influence an individual's healthcare outcome. And what precision medicine wants to do is to be able to accurately measure and quantify these different factors for different populations, individuals, and groups, such that we can begin to deliver and develop services and tools that can be used to deliver the types of things that we see on the right hand side. Can we use this sort of information to accurately predict who will be at risk of cancer or early heart attack before it happens because we can intervene early? Can we then begin to use this data to more accurately diagnose not just what sort of heart disease you have, but what subtype that will ultimately influence the types of therapies that you respond to, and so we can optimize treatments and avoid treating you with an expensive drug that may not work for your particular disease condition. And finally, can we use this sort of information, begin to understand some of the underlying pathways that are driving health, that are driving disease, and develop new therapies, new platforms that can be used to represent the next therapeutics, the next drugs of the future. So I think those are kind of the goals that precision medicine can achieve by taking into account variation in genes, environment, and the lifestyle. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with the why. And why is it that precision medicine, and I will highlight a slide later on, is fast taking shape in not just in Singapore, but in many countries all over the globe. And part of the reason, and this is data from Singapore that you see on this slide, is that the current way that many countries, including Singapore, which has a very, very good healthcare system, by the way, um, is delivering healthcare is actually under significant pressure. We know that even in Singapore, we have one of the world's highest life expectancies, but many of these individuals in the last decade of life will be ill. They will require services, healthcare services. They will require therapies that are increasing in price. And so this is actually putting a lot of pressure on our healthcare budget because all of us are growing older and all of us will present with more and more chronic disease. So this is actually uh, causing governments, ministries to relook this sort of idea of do we need to treat everybody in the same way, particularly for expensive drugs? Can we begin to prolong health rather than treat disease? And this is where this whole precision medicine play comes to the fore. Next slide, please. So we have to start somewhere. And if you remember the iceberg, the foundational aspect that on which behavior and lifestyle builds upon to influence disease is your genome or what you are born with. And when we began to look at what might make sense for a precision medicine program in Singapore, we realized that there was a big unmet need in the world that we needed to do ourselves, but by doing that, we can also contribute on the world stage. And that is the fact that a lot of genomic data And this is even worse for phenotypic data. I'll get into a part about that. It's actually missing from global repository. So if you look on the left-hand side, if you look at a column called EXAC, exact, this is the world's largest public consortia of available genome data. And if you look at the bottom in green, that's the percentage that's contributed by East Asian individuals. And most of it, likely so, is largely dominated by Western populations, Caucasian populations. And this is actually not improving if you look on the right-hand side, that there is this great unmet need that we need to use in order to practice this for research and also for clinical care. So we felt that we wanted to be able to plug this gap as a start. Next slide, please. And the genome is just the start. As we begin to uh, evolve our understanding of the contributors to health and disease, we're beginning to understand that now there are many, many diseases and conditions that we seem to be different or more prevalent in populations in Asia. Some of these are contributed by genetics, some of these are contributed by lifestyle, some of these are contributed by the environment. But all of these are very prevalent in Asia. So different types of cancer, nasopharyngeal cancer, stomach cancer, some types of lung cancer. The way that diabetes presents in Asians is different from that of the West. And it's not that unreasonable to think that because the disease presents differently, maybe the pathways that drive disease are different, maybe the way that we should treat them, but all of the drug discovery and the pharmaceutical development is largely has been based in Western populations. So by understanding the Asian phenotype better, maybe we can also begin to treat Asians in a more rational way. And we want to be able to build that evidence base where we can at least investigate that possibility. Next slide, please. So, what has catalyzed this, both the pressure on the healthcare system to use data to deliver healthcare in a more targeted, personalized way, and the notion that by measuring your genome, your lifestyle, at a molecular level in populations, we can get new disease insights. Many countries have actually catalyzed uh, precision medicine programs. And I won't go through all of them, but perhaps I'll highlight a few. On the top left-hand corner, we have the United States. They have a program called All of Us that looks at 1 million individuals, and on the top right-hand side, even our colleagues in Thailand have introduced a precision medicine program where they're focusing on cancer and rare disease. And what I'd like to do today is to tell you about how we are doing this in Singapore, and that plays to some of the competitive strengths and the advantages that we have in our Singapore population. Next slide, please. So in terms of our competitive advantages, I won't go into all of them, but I'll just highlight a few. So on the top left-hand side is a notion that we have access to Asian diversity. Singapore is one of the few places in the world where we have three major ethnic groups and a variety of minority ethnic groups as well that are all living in one specific geographical location. It's very hard to see that in other countries. We have the ability to have a unique identifier that allows us to track outcomes and data about individuals across different government healthcare databases. And we also are able to build upon our good infrastructure for healthcare, as I alluded to, and also our research environment, many, many, many years of investment on research, to be able to bring all of these different factors together to develop a program in precision medicine. Now, what is missing here, and I think that we want to have a conversation on this, is the goal of local industry in this space. And we would welcome your thoughts on how we can put that as an additional circle, such that ultimately the findings that we make are translated locally. We can capture that value in this country, or at least in this part of the world. Next slide, please. So we will now talk about all of these factors and what does it mean about precision medicine in Singapore. Next slide, please. So when we started to think about this program, and this was probably about 2015, 2016, so more than 5 years ago, what we realized was that a precision medicine is what we call an ecosystem play. It's in order to realize precision medicine in Singapore, we needed to tackle many different barriers that are not just seen in Singapore, but seen in other countries of the world. And if we can do a good shot at that, we have an ability for this sort of project to be transformational. Uh, we had so just some examples. We knew that we needed to provide the right enabling government infrastructure and policies in place at the highest level that would assure people about confidentially about their data, and also to reassure them that they would not be discriminated against if they were to permit their information to be used for research. We needed to be able to make sure that the citizenry, the Singapore's, understand what we're trying to do, that understand their concerns, both at the level of the clinicians, the public, religious leaders, and all the way on to the right-hand side. How then do we bring novel types of implementations on number 5 to the mainstream healthcare situation? And this is what we call an area of implementation science, which is how do you actually change processes in the clinical sector, which by definition is a fairly traditional, conservative uh, bastion, and rightfully so, because obviously you're emphasizing patient safety. Next slide, please. So in order to do this, what we needed to assemble was a task force that had a number of different government agencies and the research performers. So these are the people that actually do the research, that to have conversations about what would make sense for Singapore, that would balance these different pressures. The research agenda, how do we use data for research? The clinical agenda, how do we bring these processes into the clinic without blowing up healthcare costs? The economic agenda, how can we use this to catalyze, track companies, grow companies in Singapore? So the next slide, please. And so we conceived of a 10-year strategy that is shown on this slide, of which the strategy is divided into 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, of which phase 1 has just finished, and we are just started phase 2 as of last month. Um, and the way that we did it in phases was to take a very pragmatic idea, is that let us try to continually build value for the country. So in phase 1, we started modestly, and I'll tell you about this 10,000 project. And if it works and adds value, then we can move on to phase 2. And if phase 2 adds value, so we'll check back with me in about a few years from now, we can then go on to phase 3. But essentially, each phase is 10 times the previous phase. So in phase 1, we're targeting 10,000 individuals. In phase 2, we're targeting 100,000 individuals. And phase 3, we're targeting 1 million individuals. And in addition to the science, in addition to the clinical work, we're trying to build the regulatory, the bioethics pathway, such that we can responsibly use this sort of information that ultimately makes sense for Singapore in the long term. Next slide, please. So in phase 1, which took us about from 2017 to 2020, there was a bit of a 1-year gap because of COVID, and it's still going on now. We tried to do things that would help the ecosystem. So on the left-hand side, we were able to work with the Ministry of Health to pass 2 policies. The first policy was to standardize the way that clinical genetic testing services are delivered in Singapore. One of the major contributors to good healthcare delivery is actually a lot of variation between different clinical care providers and how they approach a disease. And so this provides a reference on what different services, if they want to offer clinical genetic testing, have to adhere to in terms of the qualifications, in terms of the types of the requirements for genetic counseling, and so on. At the bottom left, we will also be able to work with the Ministry of Health and the Life Insurance Agency to pass a moratorium on the use of genetic information in these research studies on genetic discrimination. And this took us about 3 years to do. And it is very similar to similar policies that are in place in the US. There's called the GINA Act, and in the UK. And it really provides assurance to individuals that they will not be denied life insurance if they, for instance, have a particular gene, so they can fully embrace their genes in terms of the promotion of health. We were also able to work on the right-hand side with the Ministry of Health to develop the workforce to think about strategies on how to increase the cadre of clinical genetics, counselors, bioinformaticians, and this was a mixture of upskilling people in adjacent sectors, but also sending scholarships for people for more in-depth training and a hybrid of these different approaches, such that we would have more people on the ground to be able to implement this program. Next slide, please. There was a very large public trust, public engagement effort, and this is where we work very closely with the Center for Biomedical Ethics at NUS to ask the public through focus groups, citizen consultations, online surveys about what they feel about precision medicine, the definition, what are their expectations. And a lot of this is informing us in how we are calibrating the program. I just want to highlight the middle part, which seems small, of 20 people, but this was actually very important because this was actually a very, very focused, a 4-day event where we met with these 20 individuals that represent different sectors of the Singapore population. And we asked them one very simple question that is going to be very relevant to this audience is, what are your attitudes or what are your expectations in sharing data, your data for use by industry? And if there are interests on that, we can come back to that in the Q&A on some of their thoughts and concerns about industry access to this sort of healthcare genomic information. Next slide, please. So in phase one, we targeted the sequencing of 10,000 Singaporeans. This number is not just a nice number because it has 4 round zeros. It actually is looking at, based upon simulations, on the number of individuals that we need to sequence in order to capture all of, I'm going to use a term here, frequent genetic alleles in the Singapore population, meaning that these are the mutations that occur above 1%. The reason why this is important is because if it occurs in about more than 1% of the population, it is likely not disease causing. But even if we looked at these variants and compared them to Western databases, we identified that we found millions of these common variants that are common in Asia but not present in Western databases. So let me tell you what that actually means in practice. It means that if you are sequenced in the West and you're Asian and you are compared against a wrong database, they will think that your mutation is rare, disease causing, and you could be treated. Whereas in reality, it is simply a common mutation in Asia, but you could be compared against the wrong type of database. So this is the clinical implication of not having the correct reference database. So using that, we were able to create this, what is normal or non-disease causing in the Asian genome. And it's actually being used by clinicians in Singapore now to accelerate their treatment of patients with genetic disease. And last heard is that we can cut down the time of response by about 40%. And we were able to publish a first draft of the first 5,000 on the journal of one of the leading scientific journals in the world, Cell. I think it's the first time the Singapore flag has been on the cover of this particular journal. I also talk a bit our future and what we're trying to do to enable this data to be accessed by as many people as possible. Next slide, please. What we find is that even though we sequence 10,000 Singaporeans, and even though these 10,000, when we enroll them, feel that they are well, we find that about 1% of individuals, and I have another slide to show about this, actually has something in their genome that says you should get treated right away. And so these are individuals that perhaps have a mutation that predisposes them to cancer. So some of you may have heard about the BRCA1 gene that Angelina Jolie has. So we find individuals with mutations in BRCA1, and this has an impact on their risk of cancer. And because these mutations are inherited, has an impact on their family members. And so in addition to sequencing and using the database, we were able to develop a clinical workflow to identify that 1% of participants, return results back to them, and then to be able to get them to look at those findings and to manage their health. And so this is an example of how this sort of work can have immediate clinical impact. It's 1% because we're only looking at the low-hanging fruit. But as we sequence more, as we understand more about other disease mutations, this 1% will grow to 2%, 10%, and so on. So I would say that this is something that and everybody has something in their genome that probably has some level of medical relevance. We just need to find out for you what that is. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about some interesting case studies here. And this idea about um, the relationships, between in the iceberg. Remember I told you about the genetics, the lifestyle, the environment. And while we think of these as separate buckets, actually the relationships between them are very complex. And I'm going to give you one example of this. And it's the example of how the environment can change your genome, which we normally think of as hardwired and stable. And I'm going to be talking to you about a very specific aspect of the genome that we call the telomere. Uh, so our genome is found in every cell as chromosomes. There are 23 chromosomes, 22 and a sex chromosome X and Y. And the telomeres, if you can see the red dot here, are the ends of your chromosomes that protect your chromosomes from damage. That it turns out, if you look on the right-hand side, that as we age, your telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. So between 20 to 40 age range, your telomeres are higher on the y-axis. But as you go and age to 60 or 80, you see that this is a consequence as the cells divide, your telomeres get shorter and shorter. Now, the important point is that if you look at the bottom graph, the two graphs, the red and the blue graph, individuals with shorter telomeres are at higher risk of developing many different diseases. In this case, I show you the risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So obviously, the longer your telomeres are, there's an association with more health. And but unfortunately, we can't prevent aging because all of us age. So I think this is a consequence of aging. But are there other factors that we can do to improve the length of your telomeres? And maybe I'll just show you some anecdote of that in the next slide. And an example of what you can do when you put all of the data together. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things that has come into play, and I don't know if there are any startups here that are doing this, is the rise and advent of consumer wearables. So these are your Apple Watches, these are your Fitbit monitoring. And what that provides for individuals is that it now allows us to collect data in an inexpensive way compared to hospital grade equipment in a longitudinal fashion, meaning that we can measure your heartbeat, your sleep patterns for months because you are wearing these things. And it turns out that, and I won't go through this slide too much, is that when we look at the type of data that these wearables have, here's data from Fitbit, they actually can predict risk factors for cardiovascular disease as well as a hospital grade equipment because you're basically measuring data longitudinally over time. So we can measure heartbeat, in your using your Fitbit, we can measure your daily steps using a Fitbit. The other thing that we can do on the next slide is to measure sleep patterns. And here is an example prior to COVID, of about 150 individuals that we asked to wear a Fitbit over a period of time, and we looked at their inferred sleep patterns by Fitbit. So if you look at just to highlight on this graph here, every row is an individual. You're looking at about 150 volunteers. Green is when the individual is sleeping or not moving, and purple is when the individual is moving. So quite fascinatingly, you see that when you let the data self-assemble, you see that there are patterns of Singaporeans that are defined by activity. On the top left hand, on the top, you see people that are very active early in the morning. Then in the middle group, you see people that are active very early in the evening. And then there's a middle group at the bottom, which is about, we call it the 9 to 5 group. They go to work, they come in. Now, this is pre-COVID. It's very, very fascinating to see what are these patterns now after, during the COVID crisis. So what you can do is look at the green. You can look at the amount of sleep that every individual is having. And it turns out that, we like to be the first of the world in many things, but this is not something that we should be proud of. The Singaporeans actually are the best in the world in having very, very poor sleep. And this is published on the day. So we can ask now the question that if you sleep less, does that affect your telomere patterns? And the results are shown on, if you just flash the next graph. So here, if you look at the age range, what you're doing now is I'm splitting out the different age ranges in blue, 20 to 40, 40 to 60 to 60, by low sleep and high sleep, as more or less than 6 hours a day. And what you can find is that if you're in the 20 to 40 age range and you have less than 6 hours a day, your telomere lengths are probably similar to a 60-year-old. And so this change is unfortunate. We don't know if it's reversible with more sleep. But this tells us that wouldn't it be something if the biggest change into Singapore healthcare is just to have ask everybody to have 2 hours more sleep every day. So think about that. It's a totally unknown facet of human behavior that we have not investigated yet. But it's an example of these sorts of associations you can only do when you put all of the data together. Next slide, please. So now going on to phase two. Phase two is 10 times phase one. And so I talked about Precise. We have this organization that is now going to be set up. Next slide, please. And the program of NPM Phase 2 is a pillar, one of the major programs in the RIE 2025 research funding enterprise. And this has, we are very fortunate to have to work with people like our chief health scientist, Tan Chor Chuan, in his guidance on how we can bring this to achieve reality. Next slide, please. I won't go into this in the interest of time. Next slide. Okay, what we want to do in phase two is to go from 10,000 to 100,000. And what we want to do now is not just look at genomes, but we want to look at everything. So what we have now is a 100,000 population cohort. These are individuals who are working with the different hospitals and different medical schools to collect data from 100,000 Singaporeans. We need that number because we need it to be statistically well powered and a different sequencing their DNA. We will be looking at the right-hand side. We'll be collecting information about their lifestyle, the environment. We're going to be doing physical measurements, imaging measurements, biochemical measurements. And so this will provide a very, very rich cohort that will, as these individuals progress and they come out with different types of diseases, because everybody will, we can then look back at the originating data and find out what are the factors that gave risk to those conditions. So this will be an effort that will last beyond NPM Phase 2 as this cohort matures, and it will be something that will reward the future populations of Singapore. Next slide, please. In terms of accessing clinical data, we're also working with the Ministry of Health to be able to use the fact that we have a IC number that if an individual belonging to this cohort, after they've been consented, if they encounter the Singapore healthcare system, if they get prescribed a drug, if they come down with biochemical measurement over time, this data will be pulled in and rendered de-identified in a way that then that data can be mined. So I think you hope and imagine that this is really, really deep tech, because we'll be able to have this sort of data to really inform many, many different types of questions. But even the types of security that we need in place, the idea of federated analytics, privacy preserving analytics, this is going to be in a very important area for industry partnerships. Next slide, please. The other aspect that we're actually looking quite closely with industry to partner on is bringing this to the clinic. We are aware now this is a very active space, because many, obviously, healthcare is defined as a very area for in industry development, the big growth areas. And we want to be able to work with companies that can co-develop solutions in terms of how do we implement this in hospitals, so that we can then begin to streamline and standardize the delivery of this sort of information and learn as much as possible from every patient, so that we can improve our clinical services. So watch this space on the bottom right-hand side. We'll actually be thinking about running a grant call for these clinical implementation pilots, where we'll be part of the factor will be partnerships with industry. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I am not going to go through some of the data slides. I can always come back to it, but I just wanted to perhaps highlight some of the ways that we're trying to make this data that we generated in phase 1. And in phase 2, once that data comes online, open to a larger group of individuals. The last thing we want is for this data to be locked up in some place. So maybe go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So basically, all of these slides are just showing that we have different work groups. And this is where the deep tech comes in. The data that we have is very rich, and we're trying to mine it. So this is one example over here where we're working with the Bioinformatics Institute in Singapore to be able to combine genetic information with molecular structural information of proteins that we can then begin to identify new drug targets. And this is actually driven up by, some of you may have heard about this product that was brought out in called DeepFold. It's highlighted as the big triumph in protein folding. So applying those sorts of tools, we to say if you have a mutation, how does your protein change? And certain individuals are also now trying to use this to model the impact of human genetic variation on interacting with the COVID-19 virus. Next slide, please. And another group at LKC Medicine is looking at this sort of information to be able to ask the question, how do we combine your genetics with your lifestyle data at higher levels so that we can apply machine learning to be able to find new pathways that can be targeted from drugs. And the drugs in this case, as we now know from the RNA vaccines like Moderna, will go beyond small molecules and antibodies into drugs directly based on nucleic acids. So this will be the next arm of drug development. Next slide, please. So this is probably like my last few slides. How do you have access to this data? So we are cognizant that there must be ways that this data can be out. So I'm going to share a few slides. So if you are a clinician or from an academic institute, I know that there are some of you here, and you are interested in a particular gene or particular variant in a gene, and you want its prevalence in the healthy community, you just make use of this process. You contact the A-Star Precision Medicine office you see in number 1 at the bottom, or with a list of your variants up to 1,000. And we basically have a concierge service where we will then generate that list for you, that in aggregated, and send it back to you. So we don't have any strings attached. So this is how we want to get the data out to as many people to use it as possible. Next slide, please. We are developing a web portal for people that want to go in and do their own data mining. So this will allow you again to look at aggregated data, but you can look at genes, mutations, the impact of mutations on crystal structures. And so this should be coming online, and so that we can provide credentialed users access to this sort of information. This should be coming online probably in the middle of the year. So watch this space. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in much more in-depth data, individual level data, we have a data access committee process where applicants will fill out the form, they will describe their project, we review, and then we will release the information to the individuals. For industry partners, we usually insist that you have some sort of research collaboration agreement with a local research performer. And for those, and this is so that we can begin to capture value of those sorts of industry engagements. So far, we've processed over like 40 different applications. Next slide, please. So I think this is like my final slide. What we want to do in the program is to try to have a win-win of health, research, and economy. Health, we want to be able to use it to improve population health. For research, we want to use the information to get new insights into factors that maybe we didn't think of that can improve health, like sleep. And for the economy, how do we use it to have more public-private partnerships? How do we use it to drive local startups such that we can begin to have new companies in this space, which is, as I've shown you from the world map, it's very, very active. I think that's my last slide. So I want to thank you for your time. And I've had to rush through some slides, but I'll be happy to take any questions, and any other contacts. The website is there and our contact information. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Prof. Tan. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. And we do have some interesting questions coming at a Q&A chat box. Maybe I start off the first question that actually echo with what I thought. As you share, right, we discovered the importance of all these data inputs to drive clinical insights and inform new treatments, and also find tremendous clinical benefits in the novel personalized or precision therapies. So can you comment on how broad can we expect the access to be due to the expensive cost to obtain those data, and how quickly will it scale?
Well, I think so. If I understand the question correctly, it is how broad are we going to be providing this access? And I think that that's actually a question that I would say watch this space. We are trying to balance between having the data being open, yet still respecting boundaries of confidentiality, respecting the fact that we also want ultimately for the findings to be done in a way where it's appropriately used. And so I think right now we are in the process where we're looking. This is why we have the data access application. You know, if it's aggregated data, you know, where you're not talking about individual level information, then that I think is probably a lower bar. But if you're talking about individual level type of information, then obviously the bar is higher. So we probably have to embrace the fact that it is not a one-size-fits-all for all different types of projects, and therefore we have a that data access committee in place weighs the pros and cons of each particular project. But so far we're past, after a few iterations, almost all of the different projects. There are certain aspects of the data that can only be used in the context of the consent of the participants that were given, and we have to respect that at the same time. So I would say that it's very hard to answer that question in a very simple way. But if you see an interesting, worthy use of the data, I think we want to know about it and we want to try our best to support it.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I think you also touch upon on the privacy confidential aspect that, yeah, I think a lot of audience are concerned about. And next question I will want to ask is just now in your presentation, you did mention that precision medicine is an ecosystem play, right? Yeah, so and in your slide, we see that Singapore's precision medicine initiative is funded by public funding. So in your opinion, what are the potential business models to be explored to sustain the value, extract value, and also incentivize continued growth of the ecosystem.
Yeah, so I think that, again, this is why I specifically raised that issue for this particular audience. I have some ideas, but I think this is something like we'd like to ask to work with the SGInnovate community on. How then do we are seeing a lot of these companies come out in the space. Most of them are overseas. And I don't think it's because they're better than Singapore. But so we also need that part of the ecosystem plays that we need that cadre of innovators in the, like SGInnovate, that stable of people that can look at the data and think about the right business cases that then they can go on and develop tools and applications. The reality is that the data is far richer and far have more applications than actually we have people on the ground for. So I think that's something that we want to take into account. And I would say that it's precisely because of the fact that we have this tension that I agreed to talk to SGInnovate today, because I think that this is something that we need to tackle as a community. I heard that word. I want to take one question from IVD or MOHH, which is about the high cost of this customized treatment and so on, and how do you ensure? So I think that's a very important question. It's an important question because that's the reality today. But I think that precisely because these medicines are high cost, that's where the opportunity for disruption comes in. If we can find a way to make nucleic acid therapies low cost and affordable, no, it's much harder to disrupt a market when everything is very, very cheap already. But I think it's because these are very intensive, very high. This is where the opportunity for innovation and disruption comes in. And that's what I'm particularly excited by. If you look at all of these, the biggest disruptions comes when you come in much cheaper, much more scalable. And it's crying out because these processes on developing these haven't changed in decades. So I think this is you view it as and this is driving up healthcare costs. So any solution on that, I think will have tremendous disruptive power across the world. Wouldn't it be nice if you can do it in Singapore? So that's my 2 cents on that. I don't know, but I think this, just to have that in mind. Yep.
Yeah, that makes great sense. Actually, that's what SGInnovate try to do, right? We try to build the deep tech solutions to solve important problem for on a global scale. Yeah, that's why we invest in Lucent. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, that the founder is your colleagues, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Good luck to him.
Yeah. So I would like to check if you would like to answer the question regarding the pediatric genome database.
Okay, let me see if I can find it. What is the scale of a precise pediatric genome? So this is from Matthew. Okay, so there are a few points there. I will say that it is the SG100K cohort is actually targeted not in the pediatric space. I think it's between 25 to 50 years old. Now that being said, in phase 1, we actually worked with the hospitals to characterize a birth cohort called GUSTO, which was individuals that were sequenced, they were recruited at birth, they were phenotyped. It's not a big cohort, it's about 1,000 of them, but so we have that pediatric cohort data. And guess what? Those pediatric individuals are now graduating from being children. So there's our boys to men. Some of them are going to go into national service for the males very, very soon. So we're seeing that transition, and we're seeing fascinating differences between the genomes of the GUSTO participants with the adult participants. We're seeing more disease-causing mutations in the kids because they haven't been manifested disease yet. And and I think this is and we're seeing differences in the epigenome. I haven't talked about that. We've also done the level that that represent the impact of the environment. So I think those are very fascinating areas, and we are one of the only programs that has that. Um, and we're also trying to characterize another cohort, a very smaller cohorts called SG90, Singaporeans that are above 90 years old, yet have no overt disease. So I think that having the anchor SG100K cohort as a broad spectrum, but having these very targeted selected cohorts at terminal at the end of the life cycle will be very important. And Singapore is already one of the few places where you can assemble all of that data in. Yep.
Great. Yeah. Next question, I want to ask that, so it's raised by the audience, Wish, and asking that whether some popular ancestry tests like 23andMe can generate like a clinical grade genetic data.
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot to unpack in this particular question. I think this is from Shi. So let me just read it. Can the clinical level genetics data be captured by popular ancestry? So I think that it's the types of assays used by companies like 23andMe. They are deployed on a different technology. It's called a microarray that allows fairly crude inference of the genome. I suppose what we're doing here, we're actually sequencing every single 3 billion base pairs. So the resolution is much finer scale in our case. The implicit in that question is how close can consumer genetics companies go in providing services like ancestry, exercise, diet recommendations before intruding onto the boundaries of healthcare? At which point does a test cross the line from being a recreational test, a lifestyle test, to a clinical test? And I think that that line is blurring. 23andMe obviously has been one of the people that got into trouble for that. They worked out with the FDA on their breast cancer prediction test. So my bottom line is that the moment you cross healthcare delivery, you cross a bar where the metrics of what it means to deliver high quality service are much higher. And I think that the companies like 23andMe and so on will have to face that. Sorry.
Yeah.
I hope I'm clear enough.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think the next question is rather quite technical. Is how important is long read sequencing versus short read sequencing for achieving the necessary genomic data required for a research goal? Yeah.
So this is a great question. And again, I think it also represents the fact that the technologies for doing high population scale molecular annotation are also growing very fast. I'll come back to the genome, which is a specific question, but we're also seeing new technologies related to be able to quantify tens of thousands of circulating metabolites in blood. We're seeing technologies which we can now begin to look at all of the microbes that are living in your gut, characterizing them functionally. So all of these are coming online as we speak. So the age of high throughput molecular profiling is here. Getting back to the specific question, long read is going to be the next wave. And selected individuals and groups in SG100K will also be subjected to long read sequencing, because this will also get us away from the other unspoken limitation, which is that when we do these analyses, we traditionally always compared it to a reference genome, which is actually a copy. And it turns out that when we sequence Asian genomes, we see bits of the genome that don't map to the reference genome. And these are big bits. So I think that those are actually, by going to long read where we don't have to do this reference-based mapping, is going to be a future. It's got a huge computational challenge. And so the need for quantum computing and so on, I think will be very, very important in tackling this. Yep.
Yeah. As you mentioned, right? Precision medicine is ecosystem play. Yeah. So we need to have other advance of the other technology, yeah, in order to make that happen. Yeah. So next question is, there is a gap between Asia data and sequencing with other regions. Can we reach that 1 million population in Singapore earlier than 2028? What are the challenges?
Yeah, so for Tricia, this is a great question. Obviously, Singaporeans, right? We want to do things, but we also want to do things in a rational, considered way. I would say that 10,000, 100,000, what we learned in doing the 10,000 in terms of how to improve our processes was absolutely instrumental in gearing up to do the 100,000. I'm confident that when we do the 100,000, we will learn other lessons to get to 1 million. Ultimately, our vision is a long-term vision that our vision is that everybody eventually will have sequencing, maybe not whole genome sequencing, but some sort of sequencing as part of their daily healthcare routine. So I think that's the ultimate vision. And obviously, the challenges for this is also to make sure that it's paced correctly. You don't want to overpromise. You want to be able to say that we are slowly but surely creating value. And the reality is that because this sort of data is very hard to is not so. Every little value you generate throws up a lot of very interesting questions, more than what we can answer right now. So I think this is where the excitement really is. But yes, of course, if there was a faster way to get to 1 million, I would love to hear about it.
Great, yeah. Maybe we come to the last question from Jenny. Of all the barriers to precision medicine, will you say trust and communication are the largest barrier to success?
Jenny, I think this is a very, very important point. To a certain extent, you're right. I mean, yes, there are technological challenges, but at the end of the day, we've seen efforts. I mean, maybe not in the genomic space, but other like big data efforts. Even the UK have run afoul because of breakdowns of trust and communication. So it's actually number one on our guiding principles, and I don't know if we have overcome it. I think it's something that we must always keep in mind. We must not take for granted. And the way we're doing it is having events like this, where we talk to people. Because communication is different stakeholders have have different concerns. So I think we want to try to pull them, recognize them, and have a pragmatic. But in our benefit, when we do our public engagement efforts, what we actually find are two things. One is that the Singapore population is actually very savvy. I mean, some of these complex things they actually get quite. And this is not, scientists. These are like people that, like 1,000 people. The other one is actually they're also quite pragmatic about that. They see that if this sort of information can maybe not help themselves personally, but help people like them, help future generations, I think they are willing to be part of that journey. But that being said, I think it's something that it's very special in Singapore, and it's something that we should not take for granted. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it seems like we are coming to the end to our event. Thank you very much, Prof. Tan, for sharing on your great sharing. And thank you to all our attendees for tuning in and also your engaging questions. We do hope this session has helped you to understand more about Singapore's national precision medicine strategy. And if you would like to revisit the conversation, we will be sending a post-event email with the recording to the session. Do also connect with us on our various social media channels, and we hope to see you again in our future events. And have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.